I am delighted to be joined by our guest today. In this roundtable discussion, we'll be talking about the importance of an effective professional development program in an international school setting. We'll discuss key tips and strategies that each guest has implemented in their own school context, and the impact and outcomes that these strategies have had. A key focus will be on highlighting actionable and practical steps that you can engage with and think about implementing in your own school setting. So my first question, diving straight into it, why is professional development and ongoing training for staff and teachers so important? Who'd like to kick this one off?
I'm happy to kick off. And so I think it's absolutely fundamental, if we call ourselves professionals, that it is just knitted into our modus operandi, but it does have to be supported by leadership as well. So my view is it links to both personal and professional growth and satisfaction, and that we're the poorer if we don't have good systems and structures in place. So absolutely critical, I think, to our roles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's mostly you're right, Mary, but also I would add that to motivate staff to reiterate the vision of the school as well, to ensure the quality of teaching and learning. These are all purposes that I see. And we have implemented a lot of practices, but I think we will talk about it a bit later as well in today's discussion.
I see it as having worked in schools that are time zoned a long way away from the UK, but still accessing UK-based qualifications. Upskilling a staff and having that PD is crucial, because it's very easy to go onto the international circuit and fall out of the operator's modi of what a UK teacher might be getting, particularly with the things like cognitive overload that's coming into the ECT program. So making sure that your staff that have maybe been international teaching for many years too, keeping up to date with the latest pedagogical research is just crucial. And then I also look into it in terms of a wider school view of no teacher's going to stay at an international school forever. There's always that element of moving on to the next step. So I want to upskill the staff. I want to make sure they join whatever school I'm working in, they join our school, they feel like they've improved, got better, and they move on. And then they become your brand ambassadors, because then any kind of teacher that wants to come to your school is saying, wow, I get to go to this institution, I get to learn something new and improve. And that's such a fantastic thing to have throughout. I think that can be a center for excellence for PD.
Yeah, I agree with everything been said so far. Absolutely crucial. The most powerful thing we can do to improve the student outcomes is by improving teaching and learning. And the most powerful thing we can do to improve teaching and learning is CPD. But I think Phil's made a really important point there around recruitment and retention. There are more and more international schools every year, and recruiting the best staff is becoming much more competitive. Millennials now are not really being motivated necessarily by money. It's very much that journey they're on. It's the work-life balance, and it's crucial they are progressing from one point to the next. So as a person, I see recruitment at the school I'm right now. I spend a lot of time speaking to younger teachers, and they're not really too fussed on the package around accommodation, etc. It really is the, what will you do for me? What will you enable me to kind of progress over the next few years? And there are some schools that really are selling quite heavily their position as a CPD school. You come here and you'll get great CPD. My wife recently moved to a new school, and everyone knows that school in Dubai has been great for CPD. And it was everyone I kind of spoke to said, yeah, you'll be really developed going there. So I think in terms of keeping staff and attracting staff, it's a really big seller for a school now to have a good, robust CPD program.
Excellent. And are there particular sort of professional development programs that you've experienced that aren't particularly as effective, or are there any things that you sort of felt maybe should be avoided in that regard at all? Anyone want to go for that one?
I don't mind starting. I go back, if we're thinking about programs and anything we're trying to implement into the school, when you're looking at strategic thinking, you need to go long term. You need to understand what you're trying to get and why, and then having some follow through on it. So when PD doesn't work, it tends to be a standalone thing that's it, and there's nothing kind of followed through with it. And that's come down to then also the content and delivery. What would we ask our teachers to do in the classroom? Ensure the content they're delivering is purposeful, energetic, and has something sequential about it. And then we want them to deliver it in a way that's engaging. So the worst PD I've come across are standalone programs that has no link to really anything the school's trying to do, and delivered in a way that's fairly poor. It's either slow paced, it's far too long, there's no ability to personalize it because it's a sort of one size fits all. And then there's nothing led out behind it. It's often either opinion based, there's no research behind what they're trying to do. And so the staff then just get used to that. You know, if you're a student in a classroom every day and the teacher was delivering one-off lessons that don't join together, it's very hard to sequentially understand what's happening. And that's the same with us with PD. We've got to make sure that there's a sequential element to it that is leading to measurable outcomes. You know, it was said earlier about that PD improves teaching and learning, which improves student outcomes. Well, then we have to think strategic and long term of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. It always stuns me that fantastic teachers, people I've seen teach classrooms of teenagers, you put them in front of a group of teachers and they stand there and they read a PowerPoint out, and it just, the mind boggles, it really does. Or sometimes I think the standalone thing, you know, a member of SLT's gone off and read one book, and now that new book is their whole philosophy for that 1 week, and it's never really spoken about again. It doesn't really chime with the school's ethos or the school's philosophy. And the whole top-down approach, I think, is really poor CPD. During COVID, what we had was, because we're all effectively NQTs, no one had done remote teaching before really, we had lots of less experienced staff that suddenly were on a level playing field with more experienced staff, and in many cases much more advanced. And so what we found was really great at my school was we had less experienced teachers sharing brilliant bits of good practice, brilliant bits of PD in a very kind of non-hierarchical way. And I think that's quite a good way of sharing. We know that students learn much better from other students than they do from a teacher. Well, actually, peer-to-peer CPD is far superior to some kind of top-down, well, I've read this one book, I've been to a conference, here's something fantastic we shall now do this week. So absolutely resonates with the idea of something sequential and emotional impact.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Something new introduced every week, and something new introduced from time to time, that's never going to help anybody. Like, you can show as many PowerPoints as you want, teachers talk at them, but nobody's really taking it in. I mean, what is when it's done in a measurable way? So what are we implementing? What is the PD for? I mean, what is the journey? Because this is what I tell teachers as well when I give observation feedback, another form of, another form of professional development. What journey are we leading the students towards, and do they know the destination? And this is the same for any PD. And I have sat in PDs where the trainer just talked at us and we didn't know what was going to happen. Yeah.
Do you find? Sorry, go on, Mary.
I would agree with all those observations. And for me, the biggest crime is when it's just a one-off. And it's not linked to any of the actual areas of development identified by the school or the setting, either, for the whole structure, nor linked to individual professional needs either. And linked to that is when there's no sense of why. So it's just delivered, but actually, well, why might this be important? And how does it link with what we're already trying to do?
Yeah, so tokenism is probably the worst thing with regards to professional development strategy, I imagine, isn't it? There needs to be that journey along the way and a why as to why you're doing what you're doing, and sort of looking at best practice then, I suppose, or strategies that have worked for you guys. Can you talk a bit about some of the teacher training that you found particularly effective, or what does best practice look like to you in your own school contexts? You'd like to go for that one, Danya?
I'm happy to kick off and just talk about what we've done. It's very much for us about CPD being done by staff, not to staff. And I think we've already touched on that a little bit now. Someone just delivering content at teachers is not effective. So what we've tried to do as much as possible is give teachers autonomy and agency. Now, what I will say is I'll place a small caveat on this. There are some elements of professional development, like safeguarding, that have to be conducted. They're mandatory, and so they have to happen in a fairly straightforward, controlled way, which is absolutely fine. But what we try to do where possible is give staff the opportunity and the ability to choose their pathway. So most CPD sessions will have more than one session running, and there'll be kind of usually 2 or 3 strands which link directly to our school improvement plan. So recently we've been looking at boys' education and the gap between boys and girls. We're looking at EAL students and also really teaching to the top. And so those strands there'll be a session on each time we have CPD, one of those 3 strands, and staff can then choose which of those they can mix it up and do one from each strand each week. That's absolutely fine, or they can just choose a single strand and pursue that all the way through. But they have the ability to choose, which is really important. And also I think it's key to value different sorts of CPD, so it's not just what happens inside the school grounds. We have staff following MPQs, master's degrees that are involved in other elements of CPD outside of school, and it's really key to us that that's valued as well. We had a fantastic CPD reading group that would sit down, a book group, a book club, and also we have a really good CPD library, and those other independent aspects of CPD need to be valued, so it's not just our offering. I think by giving staff that responsibility, they take ownership, and then it's something they're doing for themselves. It's that intrinsic motivation rather than here's something I have to do, otherwise I won't pass appraisal. So for us, that's really key. The agency and autonomy and responsibility on staff has worked well.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Talking about autonomy, being a Cambridge school, this is one thing I suggest teachers at the start of each year when we have that mandatory workshop. It's like you pick and choose your own developmental area, that you want to focus on this year, whether it's metacognition or assessment tracking, or there are so many areas to choose from, and then of course they own it. The other very effective form of CPD that we've managed to implement in the school is peer observations. People don't realize how useful these are, because then you can identify a particular area that teachers can develop and will be useful for them, and then they visit each other. So this means that it's within the school, but then again they feel ownership of that, and other teachers as well, they feel validated. Oh, all right, I'm doing something right, so I have my colleague visiting. But then again, they have the freedom to choose if they want to go and observe someone as well. Yeah, I
echo a lot of the words being said, particularly Michael's saying of being delivered to. I really do, and I feel quite passionate that any kind of CPD or PD, however you want to call it, should have some sort of research behind it. There are countless of academics over the course of decades have pulled together best practice that works. And that's amazing to pull upon that action research and then get staff to have a go at that in your school, and then set up marketplaces. One of the things we're really passionate of trying to bring here is exactly what Michael's saying, but having this idea that we run these action research projects through the year, where that is formalized through middle leadership programs, whether it's Karen Ardley, or whether we're looking at the national professional qualifications, as Michael said, or whether they're internal ones we want to run. But then we run a marketplace in August. So all of our new recruits who come and join our school, what's one of the first things they get to be part of is a massive school-wide CPD session. And they walk into something and go, wow, these guys have been running something all year based on research, with some outcomes, with some impact on students' improvement or curriculum or whatever it is they've been focused on. But hopefully it sets their mind going that the PD is a year-long thing, and that whatever they start at the start of the year, they're going to be presenting on the end of the year. And then they essentially then start leading staff through those projects even further. It takes time to build that up, but as I said, we're new here, so that's our first step to really try and get that going.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic, and what you've got going there is something that's iterative. It's going to grow deep roots, and you don't get sustainable development of professionals having impact on students if you're looking for quick fixes. So the fact you said, Philip, that it takes time, that is actually a good thing. There's quite often, the idea that we've got to pull something down quickly and make it happen quickly. Now, that's sometimes the case, but for the most part, ongoing professional development is iterative and it's over time. And a neat example that echoes what you're doing, Philip, is John Tomsit's school when he was head at Huntingdon in York. which was a research school in the north of England, and their professional development target for in each individual staff was to member of staff was to undertake a research project, and they just had to undertake it. If it didn't work, that didn't matter. The point was that they were on this journey. So all the fear taken away from it, no pressure on producing dodgy data, which for the most part, doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But what he found was hugely engaged staff, amazing results. But that was because there was the expectation. You undertook this, and their one target was to become a better teacher than it was last year, and that was the route through to it. So it's a really interesting, satisfying way of working. And the other thing I would say in relation to what I've seen that is really strong is it's couched in a way that is intellectually enticing. Why wouldn't someone want to be involved in some of this? Because it's riveting. And I think a lot of that comes when it's linked to the evidence and the research, which, it has to be said, is always provisional, because any hard science is provisional, and there's softer science, around psychology and cognitive science is never hard and fast, but they're very useful routes into exploring deeper ways of supporting pupils and students learning over time. So it's fascinating.
I love what you described there, Mary, in terms of getting staff to really engage intellectually with the material. I find, in my experience, where we are unashamedly intellectual, we get much more buy-in from the staff. And I think when we focus more almost on the training elements of kind of using platforms, etc., we really don't get the buy-in anywhere near as much. And to go back what Philip said there, and the I guess the obligation of a school to be very careful about what they share. I've been involved and received CPD on some very, very dodgy kind of areas, things like brain gym that were kind of given out almost as gospel, and it shows my age now a little bit in terms of how long I've been teaching, but very, very loose research basis, and then something that's being delivered to a whole school of teachers who then take that off and start delivering that to their students. Potentially great harm could be caused if we're not very careful with that, and that we're not very selective with that research. There isn't quite a high burden of proof before that suddenly is then shared with a lot of people, and potentially it's not the right thing.
Yeah, I think what you're identifying there, Michael, is about us professionally raising our game in terms of the way we talk about this, the way it's both an expectation and entitlement. But I don't worry about too much about stuff that was a bit naff in the past. We've all experienced it. Nobody died, but it does give us that extra lens through which to say, well, at least it's not that. Let's ramp it up to something that is more robust, has more evidence, and is more interesting behind it as well. Because it has to be said that learning styles is still a thing. I was just on a Twitter thread before I came on here. Although it's been debunked, still being laid at the door of initial teacher trainers. That's not the case. It's a shame. But one person saying that, I think this was in Scotland, saying that their child had been asked to complete a learning styles questionnaire in S5. Again, nobody's going to die, but it's just a bit of waste of time, isn't it? And so, I think it's just about being alert to what might we identify? What are the characteristics of strong working practices in this domain, and what is pretty much a waste of time? But it's not the end of the world if people go into a bit of that, as long as we draw ourselves back to stuff that has more evidence behind it.
Excellent stuff. And I was just sort of thinking about what we're saying here, and the fact that this is something that the younger generation, maybe millennials, maybe people in their early 20s that have just graduated and are now looking, done their training and now looking to move into an international school themselves. And this is something that they're looking for, right? And this is part of the retention plan. How do you present this as part of the senior leadership team? How is that presented to new teachers to make them aware of the journey that they can go on? Is that sort of part of the induction, or how is that presented in each of your school contexts?
Well, I can talk about what I've done. So it might not be the greatest kind of innovative thing, but I'm sure we all follow the same kind of thing of setting up I like to start it early. Whenever a teacher's moving internationally for the first time, there's always going to be questions of why. Are you sure? Is this really the move you want to do? And so it's all about reassuring them about what you're coming to is a great scenario. You're going to really love where you're coming. It's a great environment. And I get them into, WhatsApp groups. I get them into stuff and I start drip feeding them, whether it's stuff that's the marketing departments are doing with the teachers about the great work that's happening in classes and the actual research taking place. Or I start drip feeding stuff from Tom Sherrington or Dylan William, or just really kind of simple stuff, or the EFF, get the Education Endowment Foundation, just start having to read about what this means. How does feedback and reflection policies work? How would this work? How would this work in your subject? And just get them excited to start thinking about these things. There's the great stuff coming out of Harvard, the Project Zero stuff is fantastic to think about that. So I tend to drip those in slowly and get them thinking that fairly high intellectual score. I know Michael was saying that, and getting that idea, thinking that, come with that open mindset of improving yourself. But I tend to start that early. I find during induction, it's easy to throw lots of stuff at teachers early. And often when they're first moving internationally, all they really want to do is work out where the supermarket is, where they can live, and how to get around. So I tend to drip it in earlier to get them thinking about those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is the more practical matters that people do tend to be concerned about when they first move to a country. I have to agree. And we have had a huge intake of new staff this year, so I can totally empathize. But it's also the mandatory trainings that they have to undergo when they first join a school. So it's not professional development, like Mary was saying earlier, that we have to intellectually stimulate. I completely agree, and they not make it a burden, but rather, make them want to do it, actually excited about doing AEPD. But there are certain PDs that we have to deliver that are also mandatory. I think Michael mentioned this earlier as well. And in that sense, yes, catching them early, but I do mention the opportunities while doing the recruitment itself. And then we did pick and choose some ways of delivering those PDs in a fun way. For example, as a Kahoot even this year at the start of the year. So and the interesting thing was that they actually retained the information. So even though it was a mandatory PD, that could have been very dry and very boring, and people enjoyed it.
Yeah, for us, I think we do kind of a hybrid approach, a bit kind of retro. We have a CPD brochure, which is really high quality. So it shows what's coming over the course of the year. Staff can see very clearly right at the beginning. But in terms of what Daniel's saying, at the beginning of the year, during induction, we don't really want to give them too much of the good stuff. So we have a small teaser session, if you will, to kind of whet their appetite and say these things will be coming. So they know it's on the horizon, but we're kind of quite conscious. As Philip said, in induction week, that's probably not the time to start getting really into things like metacognition, etc. They're far too distracted, and it is actually then a bit more about the training, about how the systems of the school works and where the supermarket is, etc., etc. But we think it's important to set the scene and let them know that this is something that will really be featuring prominently in their professional lives moving forward. But they have got the brochure, and if they are keen beans, that's fine. They can start looking through, and we have a Teams group, so staff can kind of go through, and it has an archive of all of our CPD sessions on there, recordings, etc. And they can access that if they really want to kind of start going back into last year's CPD, etc. But it's really important, I think, as Philip said, to set the scene. Yes, we are selling the school, etc. During interviews. But we want to make sure they understand that this is something that's really important to us, and it's something that's not a one-off. It's something we're talking about in the appropriate time, and something they'll definitely benefit from moving forwards.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of coaching in this as well. To be working with someone who has got my best interests at heart, who I can talk through these the learning opportunities with, and who's got some experience to sort of guide me into some that would be more productive given my circumstances. Because I do think people need support around this. It can be very light touch. I think if it's just a free-for-all, what happens is, and I'm sure it's not the case in your context, but I have seen it happen where You've got a great book library with all the great thinkers on there, and you then talk to people about, well, does everyone have to read those books or a sample of those books? No, people can select them. Well, it's going to be the people who already know a lot who are going to go to those books. And so I'm always thinking about the people who might not know how valuable they are. So I'd want to be a bit more prescriptive about saying, actually, there is an expectation that you're engaged in one of these and you're able to talk about it, but it's over time. It has to be, it can't be done in just one meeting. But again, I think it needs to be made invitational, an expectation, but it's also so interesting. People are going to want to go into it in any case. The other thing I just wanted to pick up, it was the point that you made, Philip, about drip feeding as well. And you mentioned Tom Sherrington. He's a great colleague and friend of mine. And what I admire about Tom's work, not just the output of the quality and quantity of what he writes about and the books he produces, but the system he's created, as I'm sure you're aware, of walkthroughs, where the key pedagogical elements that have been identified as being reasonably robust, a lot of them based on Rosenshine's principles. There is this iterative process and program of books and films and recordings that mean it's not just this sort of one injection. It is this lovely pacing over time. And there are other programs as well that do that. So just thought I'd drop that in.
Brilliant.
I'm always sharing a few Tom Sheridan tweets with my staff. I'm always putting them out going, this is great, this is really good, have a read. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
I didn't know he was your friend, but he's fantastic, really good.
I think you made a really important point there about that guidance. I think it really is key, and the coaching relationship. We have line managers and an appraisal system, and I think it's terribly important that there's that light touch. And if there's a member of staff who has a particular area they're seeking to develop, that in their discussion with their line manager, with their coach, there's a suggestion, well, actually, maybe you would go along and see to this particular bit of CPD, or you go along, as Daniel suggests, and watch this particular teacher, for example, very good at behavior management, or this book would be really useful. And mentioning Tom Sheridan there, I think it's really important as well to role model. And so one of the things we do at our school is we share our kind of CPD journey, all of the SLT, and we talk about what we're doing. So it's not just a case of we think this is really good for you guys and something should be, no, we're doing this ourselves, and we share the CPD, we're doing master's degrees or MPQH, whatever it is we're doing, we share that. And it's very much setting the scene that everyone does this because it's really good for us to do as professionals. So that's absolutely key. And I think, definitely sharing things like tweets and quotes and just keeping that thing alive. It's something that's going on, not just here, across the world, is terribly important to us.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, Michael.
I did a thing, this was something I tried, and it's kind of those long burn ones, and you might laugh at this. I know I told this to Max, and he kind of giggled when I said this. I decided to print out a whole bunch of tweets and quotes from, all those kind of ones we're talking about, and I put them in toilets, in staff toilets, and I didn't tell anyone. And I changed them over the course of like 3 months, and it got towards the end of the year, and I said, okay, to my PD, and said, you've all seen the things in the toilets. And they all went, was that you? And yeah. And slowly I had people talking about it at the lunch queue. It was quite hilarious, kind of them following these tweets and these quotes I put in there from different things about cognitive overload or deliberate practice or retrieval practice. And naturally in the lunch queue, they go, did you see the posters changed in the toilet? And they just started talking about it. And I didn't get a chance to measure the impact on it, but it was nice just getting them at least having conversations that it made them think a different way of something.
That's impact.
Creating a culture there of thinking of good practice, isn't it? Like people thinking without.
Yeah, and it's light touch. It's amusing. It's tongue in cheek, but it will be having impacts. People are talking about it, which is great.
Love that. That's so cool. It seems like this common theme is sort of carrying the conversation and finding tools to do that, whether that's toilets or WhatsApp groups, all that kind of thing. It seems that's the way to go, isn't it? And just sort of looking at that, regards to technology being used. Michael, you mentioned Teams. Philip, you mentioned WhatsApp. Are there any other tools that you guys have used in your own school context that have been really effective in carrying that conversation on amongst teachers and staff?
haven't used, but we came close to, and I believe it's still kind of ongoing. In that, in my last school for Wellington College, very fortunate to be part of a family of schools, very similar to, I guess, Repton in that element. And what we were looking at was this idea that PD is often in schools, sadly, is a sage on a stage idea. And often it happens at 4 o'clock when teachers are often fairly tired, the brain's not really engaged or receptive. And the modern day working of companies like Google really doesn't work like that. They tend to have this idea that PD can be accessed when you want to access it. And so we were trying to look at this hybrid idea of one, having our PD sessions that we wanted all staff to come to, a part of the sequential planning that we put in. But how can we have this idea that staff could access PD anytime, anywhere that suited them, whether it was after a run or on a Sunday morning, and still have some impact that it could be shared? So we're trying to have this idea of an internal network that if someone, let's say a head of maths in one of the schools, found something they really liked, that was a research project that was working, well, rather than trying to set up a meeting with all the heads of maths to go through this, it could instantly be dropped onto an area that either maths teachers or a head of maths within the network of schools could access and read and could go on there. So it was almost like kind of a social media idea that's something there. And it had hashtags tagged to it that then you could kind of track and follow various things that were coming. That was what we were trying to do. And it linked into, I guess, something Michael said earlier about trying to have bottom-up PD, this idea that people were being inspired by seeing something, wanting to share it, and sort of wanting to see, hey, look, this worked, or have you read that, and starting genuine conversations about how to improve. I believe they're still looking at it because there's a huge task to undertake, but that's something that I think technology could really, really revolutionize, and perhaps it's something.
Oh, Philip, you're just cutting out there. I don't know if you can hear me.
Oh, sorry. I was just
Sorry.
saying,
last 5 or 6 seconds.
I wonder if something schools. I was just saying, I wonder if schools could learn something from those elite level, high performing businesses about how they do their PD, and whether we could look at something and learn from that.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, Dania, you know.
Yeah, no, definitely. I was just thinking about that. And in terms of also what I have been teaching, in fact, incidentally, we've been talking about HR and how HR works in my business class, actually. And I agree with what Philip's just said, that making it accessible, bigger companies, you mentioned Google. Yes, they do not make PD mandatory in the sense that this is when you have to, or you must do, or you sit staring at a screen or at a person. Rather make it more accessible and more optional, in the sense that, yes, we expect you to have done this by a certain time, but then you can access it whenever you want. One of the things we do is during the ski break, for example, the first couple of days, that is an optional, those are optional PD days, in the sense that people can choose to do the PD that they want to do in those days, but then they don't have to be in school. So those will be considered as working days, but then those are PD days. So what happens is that a lot of interesting PD sessions happen where they want and when they want, but then they can come back and share that. So, and they don't necessarily go and have these PD sessions, but then they happen online for the most part. So, yeah, that's one way we do it.
For us, it's been really interesting. Quite a lot of the stuff we learned during COVID about asynchronous learning. So as teachers, we suddenly had to realize that some of our students couldn't attend lessons in real time. So we had to get very good at producing lessons that could be accessed independently. But also, I think Philip's mentioned this, the ability to collaborate across different schools. So one of the things we're doing right now is we're running leadership development courses, middle leaders and senior leaders across the globe, really. So we've got a number of schools in Malaysia, the UAE, the UK, and so we're having sessions globally on Zoom. So it's fairly accessible tech, but that means that we can collaborate in a much more easy fashion. And also with our asynchronous learning, as Philip mentioned again, well, people want to work at different times. They want to access that CPD at different times when they are really in the right mindset for it. Some people work sporadically in bursts. Some people have got to, I mean, me personally, I get up at 4 a.m., work until 6 every morning. That's my perfect time when I'm really full of energy. 3 p.m. in the afternoon is really not my golden time, to be honest with you. Anything kind of, I've had not enough coffee, I'm not learning much. I don't really want to be learning much at that stage of the day. So having something asynchronous is incredibly important. And just to pick up on something that Daniel mentioned, and I think, Mary, you might like this, in terms of structured approach, we have had a system of the number of hours of CPD you had to do. You had to clock up a number of sessions. So we weren't giving people a bit of a free reign. And if they hadn't clocked up, they hadn't completed the number of sessions they had to, there were 2 days at the end of term where they had to kind of get it sorted on those 2 days. So if you've done all your CPD, you had 2 very light days at the end of the year, just before the summer. And if you hadn't done your CPD, well, that was your makeup sessions there. Now, I'm not saying we need to extrinsically motivate staff by getting them to do things like that, but actually, I think it's important that we say, we value this. We think CPD is really important. You should value it too. And we hope that you do it intrinsically because you realize it's a great thing to do. But if not, we will make sure it happens. And so that autonomy is given, but there is actually a kind of a checks and balances, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Just to pick up on the points about being live and asynchronous, I think that's one of the really interesting things that's emerged from lockdown. And I think it's made the sector far more flexible. So a quick example from something that I'm doing with John Thomsett, who's another great colleague. So on the back of the curriculum books we've done, my own work, and then the work I've done jointly with John, is we were getting a lot of requests for training, and we just didn't have the capacity. So we thought very long and hard about how to meet that demand, to meet that need. So we did a trial run in June of an 8-session intensive course, not for the faint-hearted, over 4 weeks, 7 till 8:30 on 8 elements of the curriculum, framed around the background to curriculum thinking. We're driven a lot in England by the Ofsted framework, although it's not designed our work to please Ofsted. It's actually quite a good framework in any case, intent implementation, and then supporting others. And we had people, so we just ran it at no charge. It cost us a lot to put it on, just to see how it went. Because it was live and recorded, it actually combined this quite interesting model of, if people were able to turn up, and most of them did, and we had a lot of feedback that people were shattered. We knew they would be. That's why it's not for the faint-hearted. But they found they were energized by the end of it, which is interesting, because I think if stuff is intellectually stimulating, it does sort of fire us up again. But then if people couldn't make it, then they'd got it recorded as well. So we ran the first full session, which we've just finished just over a week ago, and they're oversubscribed because people are finding them really, really interesting. But I think it's that combination of being able to turn up, ask questions, debate and negotiate, but then also to pick it up, if you're not able to attend live as well. And I don't think those models would have been thought of as quickly. I think that we're emerging in any case, because you've got a lot of wider business, particularly in the States, putting in models like this, but it was all accelerated, I think, by lockdown, made us all think differently about it.
Yeah, what you're describing there, Mary, is absolutely brilliant. It really is. And one of the things I think it's one of those almost, why didn't we do this sooner? And we've got lots of staff, for example, PE staff that have fixtures. We have staff that run extracurricular activities that would regularly miss CPD. And it seems so stupid now. I thought, well, obviously, why didn't we record it? Why didn't we get a camera there and record the sessions, and they could access them later? For years, they've just missed that CPD. They might get the PowerPoint and they could read through it. They probably never did. But now actually we have the video there, and they can watch that back and they can access it. And I think also sometimes, I'll be really honest here, if it's 3 PM, I'm a little bit sleepy and haven't taken it in first around, I'll go back and watch that session again. If I've missed a bit, I haven't got to take notes. And I think that's quite a nice thing to have, the ability to go back and access the things. It's just good teaching. We do the same thing with the students now. They've got access to that material again. They can go in their own time. So I think absolutely what you're describing is brilliant. No surprise it's oversubscribed.
Yeah, and I would just say that's really important insight in terms of PE, and of course other colleagues with commitments after school, also family commitments. There can be all sorts of reasons. And I think too that we're thinking far more laterally about consumption of good quality materials. So another quick example, and we have this free on to access on my website, but a lot of podcasts, and all we do is take, because we record everything on the main platform, not the one I've just been talking, the Martin Co platform. So you've got all these films, but then we strip out the audio and just flag up to people, you can listen to these conversations as well as watch them. Well, it's the same stuff, it's just been stripped out and slightly rebranded, but we're finding a lot of people are finding easier to access through listening to great quality conversations if they haven't got access to, you know, being able to watch something on. And of course they can do other things while they're listening. So I think the whole sector is being much more creative around high quality content and thinking about how people access it. And of course, blogs and tweets, whatever they are, they're all very stimulating.
Yeah, I think we also have an access to a wider variety of professional development these days, especially since the lockdown and the pandemic. I think people are intrinsically motivated, as Michael said, and want to do it and have access to it as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of organizations really stepped up to the plate at the start of lockdowns. I'm sure you know of the Research Ed work that goes on in England, started by Tom Bennett. That went online, and there was Research Ed Home very early on. There was Seneca Learning. There were lots of multi-academy trusts doing interesting work as well. So really pushing the boundaries, and people, keen to access them, and also because they were online, so in their own time as well, but also a lot of people losing that self-consciousness you have when you first see yourself on and hear yourself on screen. But people are kind of over that now, which is good.
Yeah.
Excellent stuff. And any final thoughts? We'll move on to our final discussion point. Great. So the final question, I mean, there's been so many little great tips and tricks, strategies that we've sort of mentioned here. Is there any particular strategy or actionable practical step that you would, or maybe something that's worked for you in particular in your school context, that you would advise a school that's maybe looking to develop their professional development journey furthermore? Is there an area that you would advise that they think of first? Is there a particular strategy that you would advise any school to perhaps try that's worked for you? Who would like to take that one?
I can kick off.
I don't mind, Gary. Go on, Michael.
You sure? Thank you for such jumping. So one of the things that's been really interesting recently, I heard John Hattie speak at a conference here in Dubai about 3 weeks ago, and he was speaking about effect sizes and of COVID. That was a key thing. The reason I was there because he was going to big reveal the impact of COVID in some meta-analyses, and it turns out the impact on COVID of learning has actually been quite small, a small negative effect. But then what he did to kind of contrast that was he showed the impact of a negative relationship between a child and their teacher. If the child's perception is that their teacher doesn't like them, and that was huge, probably 3 or 4 times greater than the impact of COVID. And that really shook me to my core, because I think all of us probably did phenomenal work during COVID, moving from in-person teaching to remote learning, all different sorts of protocols, and hours spent recording webinars and voiceovers on PowerPoint, all that kind of stuff. And actually, the impact of COVID was very, very minor. And probably, if I'm being really honest here, we spent a fraction of that time on developing positive relationships and teaching staff and looking at CPD around positive relationships with the students and positive ed. So I would, and I'm sure all of my staff will be shocked at this, that the deputy academic at Repton Dubai is going to say it's not necessarily for me about the curriculum pedagogy, but a bit more about positivity and the relationships and those things that are not really necessarily part of the taught curriculum. So I'd say those things. And the second thing I would say has been really powerful I know Mary mentioned she lives in Wales, but it's not meant to be political. It's devolution, and actually giving heads of department and departments a bit of freedom and giving them some time to look and they think, well, actually, for us as a department, I'm a scientist. What's the science department's main priority? What are we going to spend time on? And really get deep into that subject-specific CPD as opposed to the global school-level CPD. So they're the two key things: positive education and relationships, well-being, I guess, in the round. Then also really giving some time, quality time to departments to focus on what they need. And that will be different from department to department. So most of our heads of department absolutely relish the opportunity to really lead CPD and share good practice within the department time. So they're the two key things that we're doing quite a lot of at my school at the moment.
Okay. Michael, that's very interesting, because this was something that we actually discussed today, because we are having the first round of observations in school. And of course, it's department heads that are doing the observations. And based on that, in fact, we are developing it a little bit further, because we are discussing about the heads of departments taking a thread, an idea from the observations, and then running a workshop based on that, first for the department and then for the whole school. And this is an area that we would like to work on further, because there are good practices there that can be shared with the wider school community, but then first within the department. So this is something that we are looking to develop at the moment as well. It'll be interesting to touch base later on.
I would suggest, Max's question was about any school, let's say. I would say, if I was going to give anyone advice about setting up PD in their school, I would first of all audit your staff, figure out their strengths and weaknesses. What do you think the school needs, and what skills do you have within your school? Then start to think about, what do you want to get out of the training and why? What training are you going to do and why are you going to do it? Then look at the research that says around that, and what should you be doing and why that follows on there. And then make sure you embed it in a whole school way, but make sure departments, just like Michael was saying, make sure departments have time to follow this through. And there's time for them. That's the biggest complaint I ever get. Whenever schools try and bring something in, that I always get the argument, we've got no time. So make sure you factor in time, and there's a longer term strategic view to it. And then set yourself some measurable success criteria that you can evaluate that what you've done has worked. And if it hasn't, that's okay, because that's kind of what research is about. Figure out what works and what doesn't work, evaluate it, and move forward again. But I would start always audit your staff, and whoever that is, whether that's learning walks, lesson observations, book looks, whether it's more informal, just circulating around, understanding relationships, whether it's doing like a path survey and figure out how the students feel about the school, or a Harvard Graduate School of Education relationship mapping exercise, whatever it is you feel, audit your staff to figure out where the strengths and weaknesses lie.
But if I just may pick up on something you said there, I think auditing is absolutely crucial, but from a slightly different angle for us, it's capacity as well. And if you look at the kind of staff's capacity for learning, if they're completely swamped with marking and they're not really coping in their day-to-day teaching, you coming along with a fantabulous CPD program after school, they're not the buy into that, because they'll be in the back of their mind thinking, well, actually, I'll be marking that set of year 7 books right now, got those reports to write. So it's a bit kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You need to make sure that they've got that capacity first. So absolutely audit what they can do, what they need, but also, are they what's their well-being like? Are they actually able to engage with that CPD? Because if they're not, a bit like the students, if they've got a really rough home life or there's something going outside of school, they're not going to be able to focus on CPD. So absolutely order them to make sure they've got that capacity. But everything else you described is phenomenal, absolutely brilliant. I'm going to pass that off as my own ideas tomorrow in our SLT meeting, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I echo that. I've actually written a lot about it in Back on Track, about, if we want to get this stuff done well, what are some of the practices, certainly in the English system, that are getting in the way, that are not adding value to pupils' learning, but because they have historically always been done, there's an expectation they continue to be done. And I have a short hit list, one of which is marking. We know from Dylan William, most marking makes absolutely no difference to student outcomes. Notice my word, most. All right, so we mark very judiciously. Most of it is live feedback in the classroom. We know that has makes the greatest difference. There are huge problems with dodgy data being entered into spreadsheets that don't tell anyone anything. and then lots of differentiated planning and all this sort of stuff. So really cutting it back and asking everything that might be getting in the way of this rich diet that we've been talking about. And I just wanted to offer this anecdote of what I thought was a really interesting model in one instance from one primary head teacher who was concerned that his staff did not have a wide enough knowledge of children's literature beyond a diet of Williams and Roald Dahl. And instead of sort of stressing about this and nagging his colleagues, they came in for a staff meeting, expecting the usual hierarchy of things that are covered. And instead of that, they just, he put a pile of children's books on the table. And he said, just pick up one that takes your fancy and spend the next half an hour or so reading it and skimming it, and then come back and we'll spend the rest of the time just chatting about what you found. And what emerged was that virtually everybody wanted to take their book home. That wasn't the intention. So what was going on there? Their curiosity had been provoked. They were intellectually stimulated. And so that's the space I think we want everyone to be in. And then what would normally have been covered in that staff meeting was just done in an email. So it's about reframing how we think about meetings as well. And I think being really brutal about them and following Greg McCann's essentialist principles, chuck out anything that is not working and crack on with this really interesting stuff. And I think that's a really helpful insight in terms of being creative and clever about use of staff time. End of anecdote.
Fantastic stuff. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up? All right, good stuff. All right, fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for joining. It was super interesting conversation. Loads of ideas and thoughts and insights that I'm sure going to be incredibly useful to listeners. And yeah, maybe ideas that have been shared in your own school context too that you can take on. So yeah, thank you so much once again for your time. And yeah, maybe look forward to a part 2 sometime in the future. But yeah, thank you once again.